with AP exam tip number 10, which is you got to talk the talk. So what we mean here is that you have to be very specific in the language that you use when you're writing up your solutions to your free response questions. Any misuse of a term could result in a deduction. So the way the rubrics are written for the AP exam, if you misuse a term, it could take you from an E, essentially correct, down to a P, partially correct, or from a P, partially correct, down to an I for incorrect. So based on reading AP exams for several years now, there are some terms that we see quite often that students use or maybe misuse too loosely here, because these terms have very specific statistical meanings. So confounding, biased, and skewed are very often used by students as a synonym for bad. These terms are good statistical terms to use, but you have to be using them in the right context. Okay, confounding variable is something that makes it difficult to tell whether an explanatory variable is causing changes in a response variable. When we say biased, we're typically referring to a sampling method which consistently overestimates or underestimates the truth. And when we're using the term skewed, we're most often referring to the shape of a distribution for a quantitative variable. Now, another example that shows up very specifically in a couple of rubrics is the idea of blocking versus stratified. Now, in both cases, you're taking some big whole group and splitting it up into groups where within the groups, the individuals are similar. But you have to be very clear that when you are dealing with an experimental design, you would be use blocking, whereas if you're doing some sort of sampling procedure, you would be stratified sampling. So you have to make sure that you're using the correct term based on the context. Similarly, the idea of a distribution being normal versus approximately normal, this has shown up specifically in rubrics where most often you're going to want to say that something is approximately normal. So when we check the large counts condition or the large sample condition, that allows us to say that the sampling distribution is approximately normal. You don't want to say exactly normal in that case. That could cause your score to go down. Now, not only is your language important, but also the symbols that you use when you write up your solutions. So your notation has to be correct. So misuse of symbols will often result in a mandatory deduction. So this happens most often when students are showing some of their work. Maybe they're calculating a confidence interval and they show the formula. You got to make sure that you're using the correct symbols in your work. So if you're referring to the proportion for the whole population, you use P, whereas a sample proportion is P hat. And similarly, a population mean is mu, whereas a sample mean is X bar. So here's our advice. First of all, you just got to know your stuff. You got to know the vocabulary terms and you got to know the notation. You got to know the difference between a statistic and a parameter. Next, only use terms and symbols that you know. It's better to explain in your own words than to use a term or symbol incorrectly. So maybe if you forgot the term stratified sampling, you could just instead describe a sampling method where you would take the whole population, split it into groups, where within each group people are similar, without actually using the term. Or maybe instead of using the incorrect notation, you could just say sample proportion instead of P hat. And then this one is extremely important, shows up on rubrics all the time. You want to make sure that when you're writing up your answers to a free response question, that you're including context in your responses. So you don't want to say something like the distribution of data or the distribution of values. Instead, you might say something like the distribution of prices for one-bedroom apartments. So make sure you include that context. Okay, let's move on to AP exam tip number 9, prepare your workspace. And this is one that is going to be specifically different for the 2020 AP exam because this is going to be an at-home AP exam rather than one that you would take at school. So here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, you want to make sure that you have the formula sheet and tables. They're ready and available during the exam. And a special note here that the formula sheet is brand new for 2020, so make sure you're not printing out the old version. One quick way to check that you have the correct formula sheet is that in the new one, you'll see formulas for the mean and the standard deviation of a geometric distribution, which those two formulas were not available on the previous version. Next up is to make sure you have your calculator charged and ready. Now, the calculator may not be required for the exam this year, but most certainly it can probably be a help to you and a benefit. So you just want to have it ready and all charged up, ready to go. And then this is an important one. You want to make sure that the place where you're going to take the AP exam, you do some studying ahead of time in that room. There's actually plenty of research which suggests that if you study some material in the same context where you'll be taking an exam on that material, that you actually retain the information better. So you most certainly don't want to be in that room for the first time on the AP exam day. Now, number 8, manage your time, is also going to look a little bit different for this year's AP exam because of the different format. And this one is going to be extremely, extremely important for this year. The 2020 AP Stats exam is going to be 1 full year's worth of learning boiled down to 2 pre-response questions. Question 1 will be 25 minutes, worth 55% of the exam. And then you will have 5 minutes to upload your answer for question number 1. Once you upload your answer from question 1, question 2 becomes available, which you'll have 15 minutes to work on, and then an upload time of 5 minutes. Now, once you submit that answer for question number 1 and move on to question number 2, you will not be allowed to go back and work on question number 1. So here's a couple of tips. First here, make sure that you don't spend too much time on an individual part of a question. Okay, most definitely each one of these 2 questions is going to be multiple parts. Probably 5 or 6 parts for question 1 and probably 4 or 5 parts for question number 2. So you're going to have about 3 to 5 minutes on each part within the question. So you want to make sure that you're not spending something like 10 minutes working on one part of one of the questions. Next up, don't get too stressed if you feel uncertain or confused about one part or another. It turns out that you'll probably still be able to get even a 5 on the AP exam, even if you didn't write anything down for one of the parts. So don't let that hang in your head. Move on to the next part and just be confident. And then the last tip here, if you can, you don't want to leave anything blank. There's no penalty for guessing on things, and you can get partial credit for partial answer. So even if you just have some sort of random guess at it, put that guess down on the paper before you move on to the next part. So that takes us through AP exam tips number 10, 9, and 8. I am now going to pass it over to Josh, who's going to take you through the next couple tips here.
All right. Well, thank you, Luke. Let's see if I can get this going here, showing my screen. And everybody's looking at tip number 7, is that right?
That's right, Josh.
Okay, good. Everybody else was muted. All right, so number 7 is practice with your technology. This particular tip is really special for this year. First, you want to make sure, whoops, what just happened there? Sorry.
I think there might be animations on the slide.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get, oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about all the technical difficulties here. You want to use the computer or your phone for uploading or downloading your test exam. So the delivery of this year's exam is obviously quite different than previous years. So I'm going to put a link at the bottom of this particular slide that's going to reveal some information that the College Board presented to help students and teachers feel a whole lot more comfortable with this year's format. Second tip here is that you must use the same device for accessing questions and then uploading your answers. So what we're talking about here is students would often, I think, be inclined in a statistics class to write out their answers by hand with a paper and pencil, and then take a picture of that and upload it. So on the webinar that we watched last night with Trevor Packer from the College Board, they suggested that there's 3 ways that you could perhaps manage this process. One way would be to use a laptop or a desktop to access the questions, and then type your answers in a Word document or a Google Doc and copy and paste those answers and submit them through the same laptop or desktop that you access the questions from. Another way that you could do this is again with a desktop or a laptop to view the questions. Write up your answers in a Google Doc or a Word doc and then save it as a file like a PDF or a Word doc and then upload that file. Now, if you want to write it out by hand, their suggested method was to use your phone to download the questions or access the questions, then write out your answers on a piece of paper, take a picture, and then upload your answers from your phone. It is possible that you can access the questions on a computer, write it out by hand, take a picture of your answers with your phone, but then you have to send that picture from your phone to your computer because you have to use the same device to upload your answer as the device you're using to access the questions. So there's going to be opportunities for students to practice. College Board has said May 4th is the magic day for when they'll have opportunities for students to practice this process. And again, I'll give you a link in just a second with more details. The third thing is related to what I was just saying, which is getting familiar with the testing platform. Obviously, this year is going to be very different, and I think students and teachers are nervous about it. But the College Board is committed to making this a smooth process, and the best way to make it a smooth process is to practice. Again, there'll be an opportunity for students to do that starting on May 4th. So you want to be paying attention to My AP and AP Classroom for that information. They've also said in the webinar last night that if students do have technical difficulties during the exam, maybe they lose power or they get disconnected from the internet or something like that, that those students will be able to take the makeup exam the first week of June. They were specific in saying that running out of time and not uploading your answer in time is not a reason for a retake. But other types of technical difficulties, they will allow you to do the retest in June, which is one reason why they strongly encourage every student to take the test in May so that they have a backup in June if there were to be some sorts of problems. And now here's the link that I was referring to earlier. This is going to be really helpful. It's a long document with a lot of great information. So as a teacher, I would want to read through this, make sure you understand all of it, and maybe condense it a little bit and maybe share some highlights with your students. So practice with your technology, tip number 7. All right, tip number 6 is know your inference. So you want to practice identifying the appropriate inference method for a given setting. Larry Green has a great applet, which I'll quickly link to, as well as we have a TPS handout in the teacher's resource materials. So one of the things that might be different this year on the AP exam is the fact that students are allowed to use their notes, their books, their previous assessments. They're allowed to use the internet. They're allowed to use all kinds of resources. Now, that may not be a very good use of time, but another implication of that is that the questions are going to be written so that you can't just look up the answer. So I could see very easily a question that says, you know, here's a scenario, describes an experiment or a sampling procedure, and ask the students to identify what procedure would be appropriate, because that's not something they could look up in their notes or look up on the internet, because it's going to be based on whatever specific context they're given on the exam. So spend lots of time practicing identifying inference procedures. Here's what Larry Green's applet looks like. You'll load it up and it says click the categories that you want to work on and then hit the submit button. So start by selecting all, and then you want to deselect a few of them. The prediction interval for a single value of y for a fixed x, that's not something that's covered in AP Stats. And then you want to uncheck all the 3 chi-square tests as well as one-way ANOVA. That should leave you 10 inference procedures, including 1 and 2 proportions, 1 and 2 means, and match pairs for means, both intervals and tests. So this would be great. And then you hit submit, and it just gives you examples of scenarios, and then it gives you the choices. And if you choose something incorrectly, it'll give you hints about how to get the correct answer. And there's hundreds of these scenarios. So have your students practice identifying the correct inference procedure. Another tip make sure you can manage each component in the 4-step inference process. So I don't know how likely it is that you're going to get a 4-step process where you have to write out the state and the plan and the do and the conclude, considering that they have only 2 questions to test you over the whole year's worth of material. But it's certainly possible that they could ask you to check the conditions, or state some hypotheses, or make a conclusion, or interpret a confidence interval in context. So it's unclear whether you'll have to do the 4-step process from scratch, but it's almost a guarantee that you're going to have to do at least some parts of that process somewhere in the 2 questions on this year's AP exam. Here's a reminder of what those 4 steps are, both for confidence intervals and significance tests. If you use the practice of statistics, these 4 steps, the state, plan, do, conclude, should be very familiar to you by now. All right, tip number 5, the naked answer means no credit. Here's the directions that you'll see at the beginning of every AP exam. It says, show all your work. Indicate clearly the methods you use, because you'll be graded on the, hold on, I'm gonna move my screen for a second. Okay, on the correctness of your methods, as well as on the accuracy and completeness of your results and explanations. This is going back all the way to the very beginnings of the AP exam. Every answer requires some sort of justification or explanation or work. If it's something that's a calculation, say a probability question, just saying the probability is 0.23 might get you partial credit if it's correct, and it might get you no credit at all. You need to show some work, some linkage from the numbers that you're given in the problem to the answer that you get on the final answer that you get. Even if it's something as simple as adding 0.1 plus 0.13 from a table, you need to write out 0.1 plus 0.13 equals 0.23, so you can get credit for showing your work. Remember, naked answer, no credit. And finally, tip number 4, focus on statistical thinking. This is, of course, great advice for any AP statistics exam, any year that you're thinking about taking it, but it's especially important this year. The first tip says, be prepared to go beyond fill-in-the-blank interpretations. Now, this is a speculation that we have, that because students are allowed to use their book and allowed to use their notes, it's unlikely that there's going to be lots of opportunities to sort of do one of the fill-in-the-blank interpretations. There might be some, like interpreting a confidence interval or the slope of a least squares line, but it's unlikely that there's going to be lots of those opportunities. So it's important that you know what you're talking about, that you understand the statistical thinking involved, and you're not just filling in blanks. It's unlikely you're going to have lots of opportunities for that on this year's AP exam. Now, practice applying concepts, skills, and definitions in context. Luke mentioned this already, as always answer in context. I want to re-emphasize that in this particular point, that answering in context often means just using the variable names. So if you're describing a scatter plot, you want to talk about a relationship between the X variable, whatever that is, and the Y variable, whatever that is, and you want to name those variables. Same thing if you're describing a distribution or comparing a distribution, or describing an experiment or a sampling plan, talk about the variable names. That's a great way to earn credit for context. Okay, think about how and why things work the way they do. That, I think, is going to be a big part of this year's exam. Oftentimes, students are asked to check the conditions. Well, now that they're given their notes in their book, it's not too hard to remember what conditions are appropriate for a particular test. So they might go a little bit deeper and ask, well, why do we check this condition? Why do we check the large counts condition? Or why do we check the normal or large sample condition? Or why things work the way they do? It's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of heavy-duty probability calculation because they've told us that you should be able to do all the calculations with a paper and pencil. So it's possible that there might be a question about sampling distributions, where the question might say something like, explain why it would be appropriate to use a normal distribution in this context. And then you have to know, oh, well, maybe it's because you have a normal population, or maybe because you have a large sample size. The point here is make sure you understand why you're doing the things you're doing and what justifies their use. Finally, don't worry about calculator techniques this year. So if you're watching this for the 2020 exam, like I just said, they only require that you have a paper and pencil for doing calculations. And as Luke mentioned, I imagine it would be comforting to have your calculator with you, but I wouldn't worry too much about some of the more in-depth kinds of things that you could do on your calculator. It's more likely that you're going to be using it for dividing two fractions or multiplying by a percentage, if even that. So I wouldn't spend as much time as you might in other years worrying about calculator techniques. Instead, focus on statistical thinking. All right, so that's the end of tip 4. And now I'm going to pass this on to Darren.
Thanks, Josh. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. So I get the top 3 tips, starting with tip number 3. And this is a tip that would apply in any year, but maybe especially this year where we know there are only going to be 2 questions, each with multiple parts, as Luke mentioned. And that is, don't write too much. You've heard the old saying that less is more, but truly, on the AP Statistics exam, when you're writing out a solution, a better approach is to answer the question in context, using the variable or variables of interest, and then shut up. Smiley face there in case you don't like shut up. It really is not helpful sometimes if students just keep writing and writing, because eventually they may write something that falls afoul of the mandatory deduction rule. They might use a term incorrectly, or they may commit a flagrant foul of notation. Another tip along these lines is to avoid writing 2 different solutions or approaches to answer the same question. As readers, we're trained to, when we get parallel solutions, just grade the weaker of those 2 parallel solutions. So for example, on an inference question that might be part of this year's exam, students might be asked to state hypotheses. Well, if the students can't decide between hypotheses involving a population mean mu or a 2-sample test, or hypotheses for a paired t-test, they might be tempted to hedge their bets and write both sets of hypotheses down. Bad strategy. We're going to have to look at that as parallel solutions, and the students will be graded on the one that is the weaker one, the one that's wrong. Another piece of advice from experience, students find it pretty hard to interpret p-values as conditional probabilities or confidence levels as the long-run capture rate of a method that's used to create the confidence intervals. So we would recommend in any year that you, as students, not interpret the p-value or confidence level unless you're asked to. Now this year is a little interesting because we don't expect a sort of textbook interpretation of a p-value or fill-in-the-blank interpretation of a confidence level, because students have access to textbook notes, prior assessments, and to internet search. This is an interesting one. All 3 of us have been graders for a number of years, and we've seen students argue with the question writers. That is, in their response, they'll say something like, well, I don't really know how you could have taken a random sample of butterflies in this forest. Fascinating to know that. You may be right, but it's really not going to get you anywhere to make arguments with the question writers. Or if the question writer tells you that the conditions are met for a particular procedure, don't then proceed to try to check all those conditions. You may find that you don't have enough information in the problem to do so. All right, moving on. Tip number 2. This one is a very important one. RTQ and ATQ. And I'll bet everybody knows what they stand for. It's very important that a student read the question carefully. Most of the deductions I've seen on student papers are because the student didn't adequately read the question that was asked or did not answer the question that was asked. Maybe they answered a question they would have preferred be asked, but that isn't the one that's being scored. So in particular case, if a question asks you to do one of these things will remind you to make sure what you do. If a question asks you to describe a distribution of a quantitative variable, students should know by this point, you look at shape, outliers or other unusual features like clusters or gaps, center, and a measure of spread or variability. Some people use the acronym SOX for that. If a question asks you to compare distributions, if it's of quantitative data, you want to be sure that you explicitly compare the centers of those distributions, which one's bigger or smaller, or are they about equal, and explicitly compare the spread or variability of those distributions. Again, which one's got more or less, or about the same spread or variability. If the question asks you to describe similarities and differences, be sure you do both of them. Many students, when they see a compound instruction on the exam, will only do the first half. And so that's a pretty good guarantee for earning only partial credit. If a question asks you to explain or to justify, make sure you do that. You can't just give the answer with no explanation or justification and expect full credit. If a question asks you to choose between alternatives or options, it's really important that you make a choice and that you then justify why you chose the one you did and why you didn't choose the one that you didn't. That's showing clearly that you understand why one is the correct choice and the other one is a less than correct or less optimal choice. And if a question asks you to do more than one thing, that compound instruction, identify and interpret the slope. Don't just identify it. Or state and check conditions. Don't just state them. And certainly don't just put a check mark. Check conditions means verify conditions. And the number one tip this year, be prepared, the old Boy Scout motto, and be confident. At least 95% say. Take advantage of the wealth of exam review and preparation resources that are out there, including a few of these. In the practice of statistics, we have cumulative AP practice tests, numbers 1, 2, and 3. That covers through all of the material on this year's exam through the end of test 3. Test 4 would include chi-squared and also inference about slope, which are not covered this year. So any of those 3 cumulative AP practice tests will review important content. As was mentioned earlier, Luke has been involved with the AP classes and review on YouTube Live. And if you haven't checked any of those out yet, you really should. I enjoyed listening in, sorry about that, on 1 or 2 of them early on. So you can easily click and go here for the online AP classes and review sessions. And those will be continuing. In fact, Luke may want to tell you more about that in a moment. You might also, if you haven't yet, take advantage of the Stats Medic exam review course. I can promote Luke's very high quality site, the Stats Medic, and also the excellent review course that he and Lindsay Gallus have developed. The AP Classroom Question Bank has been opened up so that students can practice the types of free response questions, I'll put a caveat there, that they will see this year. Now, to be fair, those questions were not newly created for this year. They were taken from a prior exam, and the spirit of those questions and the parts of those questions was in the right spirit of most of this year's exam. The exception is there weren't the limitations on calculations with paper and pencil being all that was needed in the past. So some of those parts of questions might involve calculations or use of calculator menu item that really wouldn't be appropriate this year. But they are available for practice. They have a little green target in the AP Classroom so that you can identify them. And they do cover the types of thinking that would be required on this year's exam. So be sure to take a look at those. Also, Khan Academy has some very fine AP statistics practice questions, and one of those is another identify the correct inference procedure of the sort that Josh showed you at Larry Green's website. And perhaps the most important piece of advice to help you be prepared and be confident is to strategize by identifying the weak spots. the question types or content areas that you feel most nervous about seeing questions concerning on the exam, and then really dial in now, from now until May 22nd, and focus on fixing them. Make them stronger. If your luck is anything like mine was in school, the thing that I dreaded most was almost certain to come up. So there's no point hiding from your weak spots. Continue to work on your strengths so that if a question comes up in that area, that builds your confidence and also helps your score. But if you can identify those weak spots and remedy them, strengthen them up to a level where you'll be able to at least get partial credit on part of a question, that will really help you. All right, so a quick recap, and then we'll open up for some questions and answers. Tip number 10, you got to talk the talk. Number 9, special for this year, prepare your workspace. And as Luke mentioned, go ahead and do some work in the workspace prior to the exam so that you can attach those memories of your work to that space and hopefully recall them when you need them on the exam. Number 8, manage your time, especially important this year, where the countdown timer will be showing on the screen, and you'll know when you're down to the 5 minutes left for uploading on each of the 2 questions. Number 7, again, especially important this year to practice with your technology. This time we mean the technology you're going to use to access the exam and the technology you're going to use to capture your response to submit for the exam. Tip number 6, know your inference. And as Josh mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll see a full construct and interpret a confidence interval problem this year or a full carry out a significance test problem, but you're very likely to see some of the skills that are required within the 4-step process, the whys as well as the hows. Number 5, if you give a naked answer with no explanation, you should expect no credit. Anything more than that is just generosity on the part of the rubric. Number 4, as we're coming down the home stretch, focus on statistical thinking, not just how to do things, but what the underlying idea is behind what you're doing. You can rest assured that the question writers have been creative in trying to figure out how to assess what you've learned, and they do want to see things that you've learned, as well as to identify any of those weak spots. Number 3, don't write too much. You'll fall afoul of that mandatory deduction rule. Number 2, read the question and answer the question. That'll save tremendous agony when you look back at the responses that you gave later and realize that you didn't actually answer the thing they asked. And tip number 1, be prepared and be confident. Tommy, I think we'll kick it back your way.
All right.